You know that joke?
No, but please don't tell me.
All right, we are up and running. We can share additional jokes after class if you like.
Okay.
But right now we are going to get to the punchline because we have been building up to this point for the last few weeks. We began Parashat Shemot with the revelation that although we had gone down into Egypt as guests and had been free, that we were enslaved by Pharaoh and by the nation of Egypt, and that despite their best efforts to destroy us and drive us into subjugation, that we continue to flourish, but flourishing within our captivity and within our enslavement. This guy called Moses shows up and begins to perform wonders in order to demonstrate the God who is asking for us to leave is a force to be reckoned with. And Pharaoh has not been very cooperative. We talked about the whole hardening of the heart last week. After the course of 10 plagues, to go, right? And throughout all of this, it feels as though the Israelites are passive observers to everything that is happening. We were passive when Pharaoh enslaved us. We were passive when Pharaoh subjugated us and killed our children. We only saw one woman actually try to subvert his decree. That's where Moses comes in the basket and the reeds. When Moses shows up, it is he and Aaron that are arguing their case to Pharaoh, not the Israelites. And it is God performing the miracles that eventually twists the arm of Pharaoh that gets us out. Where are the Israelites? What did we do?
Great question. What were they doing?
Just sitting around waiting, right?
Making bricks.
Making bricks. Well, we knew we had to do a lot of that. But there's something else that we did. It's called making matzah. Right? The Seder happens before we go. That is one of the unique, odd things in our times. Although we now say that our Seder, the Passover sacrifice and the celebration that we have, is a commemoration. It is actually a commemoration of the sacrifice we had before we left, rather than a sacrifice that we did after we left. Remember, the first Passover sacrifice that was done the night of the slaying of the firstborn, which was before we were free, before Pharaoh had capitulated. And it is that we commemorate. And there are some, it's cart before the horse, right? We're acting free before we're free. Performing the sacrifice that we had told Pharaoh that we needed to go out in the wilderness to do, and we weren't sure what we were going to need to sacrifice, and now we're doing it smack down, downtown Egypt. We're doing it right there. So it is a very odd sequence of events. Immortalized, it becomes commemorated with the obligation, the mitzvah, of having a Passover sacrifice every single year. It's not just a get out of jail sacrifice, but it becomes something that we will relive into the future. And this is where we see the activity of the Israelites was at that moment and was an obligation for future actions. So although we may not have been especially active, in leading some sort of guerrilla warfare against Pharaoh, on that night, we committed ourselves and our children and grandchildren and everyone until now to be very active all the way going forward. And so it's with that in mind that we're going to look at chapter, rather than the beginning of Parashat Bo, we're going to be looking at chapter 12, which is on page 388, if you're in the Eitz Chaim, 388, beginning on verse 37. All right, so everyone found us on page 388? 388, verse 37 out of chapter 12. Good. Can I invite you to read? Yes.
Thank you. From Ramses to Sukkoth, about 600,000 men on foot, aside from children.
By the way, just a little pause and fun trivia to always share at your Seder. You see the name there, Ramses, right? That's Ra-Moses.
Ra-Moses.
That's where the word Moses comes from. Oh. Moses means son of, right? Ramses is the son of Ra, the Egyptian sun god Ra, right? So he's the son of the sun. Sorry, it's an English joke. Moses is the word that means son in Egyptian, in the Egyptian language. That's why so many people have Moses as part of the Egyptian names. So when you want to know why was Pharaoh's daughter naming him something that had a Hebrew meaning, he was naming him boy, son, basically. Moses. And we read a Hebrew meaning into that word. Was a perfectly fine Egyptian word. In fact, it was the best word to name a boy that you could find. Okay, so we have Ramses. We are heading out. We are leaving the country.
With 600,000 men. And moreover, a mixed multitude went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds.
Mixed multitude?
Mixed multitude.
What's the mixed multitude, this Erev Rav?
They don't say the Egyptians are coming with them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, let's be careful. It's not Egyptians only. It is a mixture of other non-Israelites that have joined us to leave. Right? So not everybody who walked out of Egypt that day was an Israelite.
Right.
Many of them who left went, you know what? This is clearly the winning horse. This is absolutely the right group to be with, because look at what's happened. And these are people who joined to the Jewish people and joined the Israelites, I should say, more precisely, and walked out of Egypt along with us. So some of them would have been Egyptian. Some of them would have been from other ethnicities that were living in Egypt at the time. But they were exiting with us at the same time.
Okay, so the sequence of events, that mixed multitude of those people also were right? It doesn't say you were.
We're gonna get there. Yeah, when we get to verses 43, we're gonna get there.
So how many were Israelites and how many were non-Israelites, and how much was the population of Egypt? Was this 10% of the population?
So
Roughly.
right. So we did a few other classes in the past. I don't remember exactly which, on the census, where we tried to do the numbers here, because the numbers are difficult. That is to say, 600,000 men, which we're going to find out later on is men that are over the age of 20, doesn't really compute as being a realistic number of, say, in Hebrew, 600,000, right? What's that?
Kishishmo.
Well, not just that, but when we have the word elef, right, that's the word in modern Hebrew. And for much of our history, we have translated to be thousand as a precise, 1,000 digits, that if I have 1,000 pennies, if I have 1,000 acres, that it's a specific number. Elef did not necessarily always mean that. It might have just as easily been used to mean the word lots, right? Or units, or myriads, platoon, right? So it's not clear whether they meant 600,000 as in one guy, two guys, three guys, four guys, or 600 bunches of troops, which would have been probably considerably less or fewer than 600,000 individual human troops. So what we do know is that it was a lot. But it was definitely not a emptying of the land of Egypt. How many of the mixed multitude there were? The number definitely seems to be narrowing it down to the Israelites themselves, the bonus people. So we've got 600 bundles of troops, platoons, whatever you want to call them, and then bonus people that have joined on with us. But the bonus people, we never get a fixed number for them.
And they baked unleavened cakes of dough that they had taken out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, since they had been driven out of Egypt and could not delay any provisions for themselves.
All right, so they're baking matzah, but they're baking matzah now because they're leaving. But we also know that you have to eat matzah when you have the Passover sacrifice. So they would have had matzah before they left, but now they still have matzah as they're leaving. One other thing here that's a little bit curious, we're not going to go into it in much detail, is the fact that they had not prepared anything. We know from right before this section, back up in verses 36 and 35, that they borrowed stuff from their Egyptians. They got clothes, they got gold, they got silver. thought to ask for food. We also know that they have livestock, but as hopefully you're aware, we're not carnivorous. We don't get most of our calories out of meat. So there definitely needed to be more bread preparation. It could simply be that the only way to prepare bread fast enough for a trip when you don't have preservatives was to make matzah rather than fluffy bread. It's also that matzah travels a lot better than fluffy bread. It doesn't go stale as fast. It doesn't rot as fast because it doesn't have as much moisture in it. So it is a better travel food than fluffy bread. But phrase, because you might have thought they would have been better prepared to leave since they sort of knew when it was happening.
You used an interesting word. You said they borrowed gold and silver. That's a contentious word.
Yes. So it's a contentious word because the Hebrew itself is slightly ambiguous, and the commentators then treat it ambiguously. Might be a better phrase that they had asked for. Now, asked for, the same Hebrew word can be used to lend me something, and asked for can also be you give me something.
Okay, because if you lend it, when are you going to return it?
Correct. On the other,
Yeah.
Right. So borrow is the common English translation that's used, but the Hebrew word is nicely ambiguous.
I've heard it referred to as back wages.
So one of the clear commentaries that try to explain why this is happening is that this was meant to be back wages. One of the other explanations is this is exactly what you do when you free slaves. In fact, something that we will find codified in Jewish law. Slave and you set them free, you don't set them free empty-handed. You give them gifts as they leave. And so this may have been a forerunner of them to do what we will later learn at Sinai is the right thing to do. So whether it's back wages or whether it's a parting gift so that there's no ill will is a little bit unclear. Good? Good. Onward.
The length of time that the Israelites lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of that 430th year, to the very day, all the ranks of the Lord departed from the land of Egypt. That was for the Lord a night of vigil to bring them out of the land of Egypt. That same night is the Lord's, one of vigil for all the children of Israel throughout the ages.
Right, and that night is, of course, what we call Pesach. That's when we celebrate the Seder every year since. Now that count, if you're interested in how long we were in Egypt, because again, the numbers are not as simple as they look, we have done that in previous classes as well, so go check the YouTube archives. Because we're moving on to verse 41.
43.
43.
43.
I have to go to the optometrist. Yes,
Okay.
43.
The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the law of the Passover offering. No foreigner shall eat of it, but any slave a man has bought may eat of it circumcised. No bound or hired laborer shall eat of it. It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the flesh outside the house, nor shall you break a bone of it. The whole community of Israel shall offer it. If a stranger who dwells with you would offer the Passover to the Lord, all his males must be circumcised. Then he shall be admitted to offer it. He shall then be as a citizen of the country. A circumcised person may eat of it. There shall be one law for the citizens and for the stranger who dwells among you."
Okay. So, perfectly clear, right?
Okay, right.
So, who can eat from the Passover sacrifice? What rules did we just learn? Got to be circumcised. So that means
Covenant with God. That means you're a Jew, doesn't it?
So really? So everybody who's circumcised is Jewish?
Well, no.
When the hospital circumcises
they
people,
circumcise everybody.
then that makes them Jewish?
But for us, if we do a circumcision, it's a covenant with.
For us, it's a Brit Milah, right?
Yeah.
Brit meaning
Brit
covenant,
Milah.
right? And Milah meaning circumcision. That it's the covenantal circumcision. Might be an English translation.
Right.
Yeah. A little confusing, yes? And is that like the only thing that's needed then? Does that mean if you're Jewish but not circumcised that you can't eat it? Because there are some people by Jewish law that don't get circumcised, namely children that come from hemophiliac families that have had previous deaths from circumcisions. By the time we've already had 2 boys die, we don't circumcise the 3rd one because of the risk of death. So does that mean he can never eat from the Passover offering? All right. So now you get to look at your handout.
And what about women? What about the error?
And to go back to your question about the Erev Rav and the mixed multitude, does that mean?
More there?
Yeah. It's a good thing I made extra.
Yeah.
Does that mean that the mixed multitude didn't get to eat? But we know that some of them took shelter with the Israelites the evening before. That's why they didn't have their firstborn wiped out. Or are they now going to need to go to some sort of special procedure in order to be ready to eat the next Passover Sabbath? It's a little ambiguous, yes? Good. We agree that it's ambiguous, then you understand why we're studying it. All right, so let's take a look at a English try of reading this phrase. And this is based off verse 43.
And what is the more literal way of reading it? The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the statute of the Passover sacrifice. No alienated one may partake of it."
Okay, so what do we mean by alienated, right? What is this foreigner that gets translated in such a nice phrase in the English, but it's not exactly. I mean, it can be translated as foreigner, but it's just someone outside of the group can't eat it. So what does that mean? Well, Rashi gives one answer. This is based off the Midrash collection known as Mechilta, which is one of the earliest copies, the earliest layers of Midrash.
So it means the alienated one is whose deeds have become alienated from his Father in heaven. Both a Gentile and an Israeli apostate are meant.
Right. So if someone is an Israelite, but they are now worshiping some Canaanite god, and it's time for Pesach, they don't get to come and eat it. They don't get to
enjoy the barbecue.
Well, they don't get to enjoy the barbecue. Yeah, exactly right. And somebody who is not part of the Jewish people, not an Israelite, which in the ancient worlds meant an idol worshiper, because it was kind of binary. You either were an Israelite or you were worshiping statues. That was just the way the world was constructed back then. You also don't get to have it. So here, the alienated, of who is it being alienated from? It's not alien from us in the sense that you're in the tribe or out of the tribe. It's alienated from God. You're an idolater or non-idolater. And a Jewish idolater is out just as much as a non-Jewish idolater is out.
Does this relate to in the book of Jonah, where God relents Ninevites because God sees their deeds and so relents? And their deeds are a reflection of their recovered fear of God, their faith.
Yes. The book of Jonah highlights a number of things that are interesting. One is that God cares about non-Jews, which other prophets had also made clear, but Jonah is the clearest story where that is all that the story is about trying to save this group. But yes, there was also
God sees their deeds. The important thing is he sees what they do, and that what they do determines their worthiness.
Well, it's what they do and what their potential becomes, right? That yes, unfortunately, they backslide eventually again. But at least at that moment, they are turning the right direction. They are trying to recover their footing, if you will, and move in the right direction. And it is about, yes, that relationship between them and God based upon what they're choosing to do. Yes.
The word ben nechar. Nechar is coming from a word, another word in Hebrew, mitnaker. Mitnaker is somebody who is against Hashem.
Like an adversary. Yes.
Adversary.
Yes. Right, exactly, and that's what the Mechil for the Midrash is playing off of, exactly. Gives a slightly different version.
Foreigner doesn't refer to someone from another nation who can convert to Judaism, but to someone of another faith, even an apostate Jew.
Right, so this is not saying that, for example, the Erev Rav, what instead it's trying to say is that non-Jews who convert are now Jewish, they can certainly eat it, but non-Jews who are of a different faith, who are worshiping Zeus or whatever else, or Jews who are worshiping another faith, they are not allowed to participate in the Passover sacrifice. They can't have the barbecue, I think Yerach said. Right? They don't get to enjoy the barbecue. So how are we doing so far? Is this clearing things up a little bit? Okay, but what about that whole circumcising thing? We got to talk about that too, right? That's the next verse.
Okay, and where it says more literal. And every man's slave purchased for his money, you shall circumcise him, and then he will be permitted to partake of it.
All right, so obviously I highlighted and italicized and underlined the word he because pronouns are slippery. Who do you think he is in that sentence?
The slave who's been circumcised.
All right. Ibn Ezra says you're wrong.
Once he's been circumcised, okay, of his own.
Oh, sorry, it's, actually, Ibn Ezra agrees with you. Rashi is disagreeing with you.
Oh,
Sorry.
thank goodness, Ibn Ezra
Yeah.
agrees. Once he has been circumcised of his own free will to turn to the religion of Israel, if he is 13 or older.
Right, so he's saying it's the slave, but the slave had to choose to be Jewish. This is not just a question of the master bought him in the market and then circumcised him and now he can sit down for dinner. It's a question of, has this person embraced Judaism and become Jewish? And there were many people who were purchased as foreign slaves who became Jewish and eventually were freed and were fully independent and equal Jews. That was not uncommon in the ancient world.
The text refers to a slave who was bought, even to those born in the household. The purchased slave was mentioned because it is the more common occurrence.
Right, so that's why we're using that particular type of language. But in general, even if a slave is born into the household, the circumcision still has to take place. Even if there's no suspicion they might be worshiping some other god, they still need to be formally brought into the wings of the Shekhinah under the umbrella of Judaism. And circumcision is the most prominent display of that status. But to answer the question, or if you answered the question, we were talking before about, well, if we're only talking about circumcision, what does this mean for women? Right? Using the text that we've gone through so far, what would be the answer for women? Which women could or couldn't partake of the sacrifice?
Okay, which grouping?
Yeah.
Maybe in the grouping, if they were Gentiles, they were.
If they were of another faith.
If they were of another faith.
Exactly right. So if they worship another faith, or if they were bought as slaves, obviously there's no circumcision permissible, but they have accepted Judaism, then they are also allowed to eat it. So it's not a question of their nationality, it's not a question of their ethnicity, it's a question of their faith.
If they say, you're, like in Ruth, if your God shall be my God, your people shall be my people.
Exactly.
That's,
They have to be bound to the destiny of the Jewish people, which is what the whole Seder is all about, is the destiny of the Jewish people. That's our moment of birth, if you will, when we are christened as a nation that will be bound forever by this experience of Egypt and of coming out in the Exodus. And for others too, to us as a people, as a faith, in order for them to really relive the Passover sacrifice in all of its gristle and detail. And for men, that will include a circumcision because that's obligatory for men, but for women, it would be the same as for men in the other side, which is the attachment to the faith.
These days, we're all so nice that sometimes for our Passover Seder, we invite our non-Jewish friends to come and see what it's like.
We will come back to that.
Oh, good, good. Why
Right.
don't we still do that?
Well, it's fine to wonder, and unfortunately, I've heard lots of people give misinformation on this point. So hopefully we will clear that up in due course.
Okay. And where it says he, which you talked about pronouns, then he will be permitted to partake of it. He means the slave's master. This tells us that the failure to perform the circumcision of one's slaves prevents one from partaking of the Passover sacrifice. Joshua. Rabbi Eliezer says, the failure to perform the circumcision of one's slaves does not prevent one from partaking of the Passover sacrifice.
The rabbis were arguing. What a surprise.
What a surprise, yes. If so, what is the meaning of, then he will be permitted to partake of it? He, in this phrase, is referring to the slave.
All right, so Rabbi Eliezer agrees with Ibn Ezra that the he, it means the slave, but point.
Yeah.
About he, the owner of the slave. So I'm a Jewish owner,
Right.
and I have bought a slave at the market, and he's not a Jewish slave, and he comes to my house, and it's time for Pesach, and I, the owner, I'm the master of the house. I don't get to have the Passover sacrifice because I haven't circumcised him. What? No. Right?
We have a precedent for that.
yeah.
With Zipporah and the kids of Moses. She circumcised them because an angel came and wanted to kill Moses.
Right. With one interpretation, it was his sons that needed to be circumcised, and Zipporah took care of it in Moses'
Because
absences. Right. In his absence or his ignorance, depending upon which way you want to read it. But there's also a more underlying statement here about the nature of the Exodus. Why would a Jewish master maybe not want to circumcise his slaves, his non-Jewish slaves?
Well, because if you circumcise, they become Jewish. then didn't have to go by the laws for
Exactly.
a Jewish slave, which means you can get out, you can get the freedom.
And when you go, you'll be given a gift, and
Right.
absolutely, right? So there might have been a cruel financial incentive for a Jewish slave owner not to bring the slaves in his household into the Jewish faith, because it would have allowed him a term of servitude over these people. What Rabbi Joshua was saying is, if you do that, you are missing the point, right? Not the point, but at least one of the points, which is, if someone comes into your dominion, you need to help them find God, help them find our faith, help them find Judaism, rather than keeping them at arm's length.
Combination, I think. I think the combination is, yes, you are part of our faith. You're an equal member of the people now.
Correct, exactly.
So it's hard to be, as a person who converted, it's hard emotionally, how do I word this? Intellectually, faith is one thing, and emotionally, faith is one thing. But to feel at home,
Socially.
to feel socially, and have something like this where this says,
That
there's
is
no difference between you.
right. That is the goal.
That's the goal.
I think there was a hand here
But
first.
there's
Yeah.
no-
Another precedent, Abraham
Mhm.
circumcised his entire household.
Yes, he did.
Like our father Abraham, everyone in your household
It is supposed to be
circumcised.
treated that way. Exactly.
Except for the Hebrew slave.
Mhm.
Indentured servitude. It's
Right.
not really slavery.
Mhm.
But having just come through the Exodus, how do we buy slaves in the first place? Where does that come from? It's bothered me for 45 years.
Only 45. No. So one thing to understand is that was not tinted by the racial ideals of American slave experiences. So we need to make sure we separate a little bit of that. But unfortunately, from at least the earliest records that we have, slavery was a standard practice of how to gain labor and cost, right? Because they didn't have the idea of salaries and such. So you would gain, now if you had someone with your own community, you would gain their labor by taking care of them, but you would have that as a limited time period so that they could hopefully get back on their feet and reconstitute themselves as an independent entity. For foreigners throughout the entire world, every single culture, through these types of levels of economic development, the slavery of non-members of your group was a standard economic feature. It wasn't always that
I
common,
know that.
but how do we keep
How
doing
do
it?
we,
Why?
after this experience?
I can't imagine why.
For the same reason, well, not the same reason, but for similar reasons of why women do not usually directly inherit from their parents, right? It was part of the economic structure of their society. At some point, we looked back and said, how could anyone let children work in factories? And yet that was perfectly natural all the way up until the early 1900s, because children had always worked.
So you're saying context.
Exactly right. Right. It was context. It was not applauded. It was not celebrated. It was not encouraged. It wasn't as though God said, go out and capture foreigners and make them slaves. And there were always limits on the treatment and rights that these people had. They were not to be brutalized and not to be exploited beyond their servitude, which is different than in many other cultures. But it was a feature of the economic landscape, and the moral landscape that actually lays the groundwork for, the foundation for, that says slavery of all forms is wrong, is something that could only evolve eventually once the economic structure of humanity had reached a point where we no longer felt compelled to use that type of servitude. But it's a very long and complex historical feature that other cultures have also had to go through. Not all of them came out the other side to a level of rejecting of slavery, but it was simply a matter of context, as you put it, of their economic condition at the time. Okay, we'll come back to
Someday we'll talk.
in more detail, absolutely.
The circumcision of slaves is an obligation on the master from Abraham and onwards. We are also commanded that slaves should rest on Shabbat and Yom Tov. And all of this elevates the status of the slave, but he is but a bit less than his master. And therefore, immediately when he is circumcised, he may eat of the Pesach offering like his master.
All right, so this is, by the way, Shadal, if I'm not mistaken, yes. And Shadal is trying to say that absolutely, as we already mentioned, from Abraham onward, we are supposed to circumcise the slave, that we are not supposed to keep them as a foreign slave with diminished rights compared to a Hebrew slave. We are supposed to help them reach towards Judaism, to be circumcised, to be almost in every way the same as us, right? He is but a bit less than his master in terms of his freedom of movement, but in terms of his spiritual rights, he is right up there alongside. That is the goal that Shadal says Judaism has.
And at the end of the Second Temple, good traits were corrupted by the kings of the house of Herod, and Israel learned the ways of the Gentiles. And in particular, the kings, nobility, and the wealthy loved to make themselves similar to the Romans. And we know that the Romans were cruel to their servants. And so there were in Israel some masters who did not wish to circumcise their slaves, such that they, the slaves, should not consider themselves Israelites and human beings.
Right? So, unfortunately, good as the Torah is, the goodness of individuals is sometimes failing. Many of our people followed the ways of the Romans, and so they deliberately prevented their servants from rising in this status. And therefore,
then the sages of Israel stood up and decreed that one who does not circumcise his slaves will not be able to eat of the Paschal offering. And their intent, in my opinion, is that one who does not consider slaves to be human is not fit to be considered among those who celebrate the festival of freedom. This was the thought process of most of the sages, and so it is taught without even attribution in the Mechilta.
right, it's just taught as this is what we do, right? That when you get a slave, you circumcise them, and then they eat at the Passover offering. And if you don't circumcise them, you, the master, are not allowed to eat from the Passover offering. Right? This was a takana. This was an edict by the rabbis in order to change the social behavior of the people who were being corrupted by Roman values in their day. Okay.
But Rabbi Eliezer says that the circumcision of one's slaves is not a requirement for being able to eat the Paschal offering, for he seized upon the path of Shammai, and he did not wish that anything be innovated at all, which was not in the Torah or in received tradition. And he did not say anything unless he heard it from his teacher.
Right. So remember, Rabbi Eliezer in our middle paragraph was arguing with Rabbi Joshua and said, no. The he just means the slave, the master, it's not contingent filth. Not because he denies the dignity of humanity, but simply he doesn't want to innovate. He doesn't want to create an edict in order to change this behavior, because that such edicts, they're not in the Torah. Right? So he was following the path of Shammai. And Shammai is considered to be stringent, but stringent in the sense of nothing should ever deviate from what I received. Modification in order to steer the needs of my time. Make sense? Okay.
Meanwhile, the rest of the sages of Israel were innovating the institution takanot according to the needs of the times. And they needed to place Rabbi Eliezer in cherem, in a ban, excommunication like, for he rose up against anything which leaned away from that which he received from his teacher.
All right, so it's a very famous episode of the Talmud where they put him under a ban, an excommunication in a sense, where no one would talk with him, no one would do business with him, no one would deal with him until he accepted the rulings of the majority, until he accepted the opinions of the other sages. And he was sticking to his guns because he was small c conservative, right? Not part of political affiliation or Jewish movement affiliation, but he was somebody who only wanted to conserve what he had been given, apply or modify in any way, shape, or form in order to meet the needs of their society, their generation. And the other sages disagreed. How are we doing on that?
Okay.
So what do we think? Shadal's explanation sound good? Maybe? Pulls together our pieces quite nicely?
Yes.
I agree. All right. Let's just take a little bit more about these non-Jews.
A Gentile who sent his burnt offering from overseas along with the libations, they are offered from what he has sent.
Right? So if you are wondering whether or not a non-Jew can make a sacrifice, even if they're not eating it, they can. Right? So if some Roman guy wants to offer a sacrifice at the temple and he sends the sacrifice to the temple and would be brought to the altar, presuming that it's, a ritually fit animal and all of those things, the sacrifice would be offered on that person's behalf. Now, they wouldn't be able to eat from it, but they can offer it. That is to say, they can designate the animal for temple's use. And indeed, we have from many of the discussions in the rabbinic times of the Roman government itself sending offerings to be offered on the altar. They didn't get to eat it, but they absolutely did provide the animal for the altar.
But that's also lovely because the priests, the Kohanim, got to eat it, otherwise they had no land and they wouldn't have had anything. So it's a way of taking care of them as well.
Among many others, yes.
Yes.
we usually looked after the Kohanim. We were okay.
Okay. One might think, as foreigner, would invalidate the group with him. Torah states, no foreigner shall eat of it. He does not eat it.
Eat it,
The
meaning
animal.
the Passover sacrifice, the meat.
Right. But he does eat matzah and maror.
All right, so there's the quickest answer to your question. Can you invite a non-Jew to a modern
Yes.
Seder? There is. Absolutely.
Yes.
Even if there was a Passover sacrifice in our days, a large chunk of meat on the table that was from the altar of Jerusalem, even if that was there, the non-Jew could still be there. They just wouldn't be able to eat that. In our own Seders, and I hope that this is true for all of us here, none of us have a sacrifice from Jerusalem because the altar is not currently there. And therefore, there is no reason for a non-Jew to avoid anything at our Seders. They should be full participants in all of the meal and all of the rites so that they can see what it is that we are celebrating. So you have done perfectly fine.
Okay.
Inviting non-Jews to your Seder is absolutely fine. When the altar is restored in Jerusalem, then one part of the menu may be off limits. But apart from that, they would still be welcomed at the Seder itself.
And we don't have to ask people, are you circumcised?
No, we don't
Checking
need
at the-
we don't need to check at the door.
Hillel and Shammai only argued in 2 or 3 matters.
All right, so we already mentioned Shammai as being stringent. That Rabbi Eliezer was following from his style. Hillel was the counterpart to Shammai. Hillel and Shammai were the 2 main teachers of their generation, and they both had unique styles. Shammai, as we already saw, tended to be stricter, stringent, small c conservative, and Hillel tended to be, and we'll see that they themselves, the 2 sages, they only argued in 2 or 3 matters, and you can look that up in the Talmud if you'd like. But their students,
Yeah,
that is to say their disciples, those who came after them, that's where trouble gets going.
Wow. When their students, who did not sufficiently serve their teachers,
That-
increased,
That means they weren't very good students.
and there were more and more of them, in Israel, and the Torah was made into 2 Torahs. We must ask, why were these called the students of Shammai and Hillel, as the different positions did not come from their teachers, but rather from their own logic?
Right? I mean, it's kind of embarrassing to
Yeah.
say the house of Shammai when it isn't actually Shammai's opinions that they're preaching, right? They're yes, carrying on his traditions, but also incorrectly in some places because they weren't perfect students. Unfair to blame the head who had founded the school of thought when he's no longer around to correct the students. And it's their mistakes.
They should have been called the stringent ones and the lenient ones, or some other names, but not based on Hillel and Shammai, who were not the source of the disputes.
Okay, so that's his basic question and answer, which is it doesn't make sense to call them Hillelites and Shammaites. Shammaites? Shammaites. It doesn't make sense to call them after the names of the teachers. But now he's going to backtrack a little bit and say, actually, maybe there is something to the character of these 2 people that does give a meaningful title to the schools that bear their name.
It seems to me is that since Hillel was humble in his character traits, a lover and pursuer of peace, who loved people and brought them closer to Torah, and as he said to that Gentile, love your neighbor as yourself, that is the entirety of the Torah.
This is a very famous story where
Yes.
someone comes and says, I want to be Jewish, teach me all on 1 foot. And that's his answer. whereas Shammai chased the guy away with a stick. So there are two very different attitudes, not just in general towards humanity, but in particular towards those seeking or interested in Judaism. And Hillel was much more welcoming and inclusive.
From there extends that most of the students who did not serve their teachers sufficiently and cleave to Hillel to learn his traits and to follow in his path, when they had a doubt in the matter of one of the rules of laws, they chose to be lenient in order to draw the common folk to Torah, so that the yoke upon their necks should not become too weighty, such that they might cast it off their necks entirely. And these students were called Beit Hillel, since they seized the path of Hillel, despite the fact that these details in which they argued did not come out to them from Hillel's mouth.
Makes sense?
Yes.
Right? So they were Hillel-ish, like in their overall outlook, even if the details that they were having trouble with were not directly from him because they had lost their notes and couldn't directly quote him on these matters.
And so the reverse. Shammai was a strict, insistent man, and he was insistent in every matter, not to lean from the line of the law, not even a hair's breadth. And some of the students chose his path, and when a doubt came about for them because they did not serve sufficiently, they chose to be stringent. And they are called Beit Shammai, since they were drawn after the position of Shammai, who was insistent to be stringent, despite their reasoning not coming to them from him.
Right? So you often find that people will be stricter than the teacher. And that's usually because they lack of wisdom and of knowledge as the teacher, right? The teacher knows precisely what is and what isn't, whereas the student, if they're not sure, will just say no. They will just choose to be strict in order to not possibly cross that line. Whereas the students of Hillel are saying, well, yes, that's all very well and good, but if you don't choose to be lenient, then you may be not crossing a possible line, but you are definitely crossing the line of pushing people away from Torah. And for a maybe, you have to try and balance that. When we're talking about certainties, like don't murder, there's no leniency when it comes to don't murder or don't commit adultery. It's not a question of, well, if we tell people adultery is okay, maybe they'll come to Torah. No. We're talking about issues of doubt here, issues of discussion and debate where there is no obvious and clear answer. And the Hillel-ish people are saying, if there's a maybe, better to be open and lenient than to be too strict. And the Shammaites are saying, if there's a maybe, better to be strict. But both of them are saying this from a position of ignorance. Values to guide them, because if you don't have knowledge, then the only thing you've got left are the values.
It seems like one group is being driven by the attribute of mercy, even to an extreme, while the other is being driven by the attribute of strict justice, even when that becomes an extreme. And an extreme of either one is not.
Well, it's not the
where
ideal.
you need to be.
Right.
And the thing with logic is great at evaluating binary problems.
Mm-hmm.
But much of faith involves paradoxes. And evaluating a paradox, it often fails because it's designed for binary problems.
Right.
That's just the nature of faith.
Right.
It's filled with paradoxes, and sometimes logic just doesn't get you where you need to go.
Right. And that's if you know there's somewhere you need to go. The best thing, of course, to have is a good map, right? Or remember the directions because you remember having driven there with your teacher, with someone who showed you, or you have a GPS, right? That's the best thing to do. Where they're debating is if you don't have a map and you've never been there before, and you're not sure exactly how to get there, figure out the right way to do it. And Shammai is, I think it is, and you don't turn aside at all. And Hillel's like, no, you got to turn left, turn right. You got to try and see if you can find the path in some other way. Stop and ask for directions. Exactly. Look for a nice person and ask them what they. Right. These are different strategies to deal with a lack of information, because when you don't have enough information, you still have to act. You still need to make decisions in life, and now you have to rely on some other tool than your map or your accurate knowledge. And that's why they're relying on principles to guide them. And that's a fundamental feature of much of humanity, right? We don't always have a perfect playbook to handle every possible situation. Sometimes we're in a place without a map, and then we have to rely upon our general principles to help us get through that point until we can find familiar ground again and know that we're back on certainty. In general, Hillel versus Shammai for the two schools of thought, which one wins?
Hello.
Hillel. Right? That is what our tradition has said in numerous places in our in Jewish law, is that Hillel is primarily, there are a few exceptions, but Beit Hillel is primarily the winner of these arguments and the one that we still follow to this day.
I know in Jewish schools, I guess that's what I did. Hillel Shammai lesson was the lighting of the Hanukkah.
Yes.
Yes.
That's what every kid, I think, was taught in Hebrew school.
One of the major disagreements between the two schools, one saying that we light one candle the first night, 2 candles the next, 3 the next, and add up. That's Beit Hillel's position. So we start with 8, and then we take away 1 candle each night until we get to the final night when there's only 1 candle left being lit. And both have logic behind them as a perfectly natural reason of why we would do it one way or the other. But in the end, Hillel wins.
Because his argument had to do with brightness and light.
Well, with holiness in general,
World.
that we never decrease in holiness, that we only increase, that we should never diminish holiness.
The
But
reprieve,
just in case you're worried about this argument between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, resolution. It's not as though we went on in ignorance forever just because we had 2 batches of bad students.
the reprieve after the destruction of the temple was an important time, convened in order to retrieve the laws that were nearly lost in the turmoil and persecutions, and as a result of the strife between the houses of Shammai and Hillel.
Right? So we were getting a little shaky, they say, because
There's no temple now. What do you do now?
well, back of the temple helped.
Yes.
Right? It gave us
You
a
had
breathing
to-
room, right? Because the
Right.
revolution against Rome had stopped,
Right.
and Rome released their persecutions a little bit right after the destruction. And that gave us breathing room to sit down and figure out not only what had been lost because of the Roman destructions, but also what had been lost because of our own internal arguing. And so they had to sit down and reconstitute the law and make sure that through their debate and discussion, they could recapture what had originally been taught by the original teachers. It's much the same way that archaeologists now can take fragments of a language and reconstitute what the original language was through very careful deduction and analysis. You can often find the pieces that were lost. Exactly what took place in this post-destruction moment.
Well, in this case, they had to, because the way you did Jewish before the destruction of the temple was to bring sacrifice to the temple. In the absence of the temple, we now know that we can interpret the law. We can't use the strict in terms. We have to come up with some new ways of doing it. It becomes okay.
Well, they
Do it.
kind of knew that before because we'd had the destruction of the first temple by the
Yes, you did.
Babylonians.
Okay.
But unfortunately, at this point, there were gaps in the chains of tradition
Yes.
because of this infighting as well as the external pressures. And so they need to sit down and refigure out what it was.
But the sages toiled mightily and examined the material until they understood what the earlier masters had said and had practiced. Thus, they finally resolved all their doubts.
Right. So much in the same way that you'll see nowadays critical editions of Aristotle and Plato, which are copies of the text that are not just passed down from scholar to scholar, monastery to scholar, all the way through the Renaissance, but are actual texts that have been put together by very, very careful analysis of all the varieties of versions of those texts to see what had been the original version. Those original texts were corrupted over the centuries. This was not centuries long. It's not quite as hard to reconstitute, but they tried to sit down with all of the different students and hear all of the opinions of all of the people and figure out from all the things they were saying what must have been the true original version. And then that was agreed upon by all the sages rather than having this factionalism. And then with that, the Mishnah and the Talmud and Jewish law that we continue to have now, which has stood up much better than the versions that were being practiced by Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai at the time. So you had the epilogue there, and know that we did resolve these debates. It just took a little bit of time. Good, good. Thank you very much for coming.
The book of Genesis is reconciliation at the end.